My pronouns are she, they. I'm one of the content producers and outreach coordinators for our Twitch digital content for GeekGirlCon. I have black and blue hair. I am not wearing black tonight, friends, but I'm wearing gray with "No one is illegal on stolen land" sweatshirt. And I'm super excited to be here. Let's take it over to Matt.
Hello, my name is MattHatterPlays. I go by he, him pronouns. I am a folklorist with my specialization being in North American native folklore and my second specialty being in American folklore. And I'm of the Hopi tribe.
Johnnie.
Hey everyone, I'm Johnniejae and I'm the founder of a tribe called Geek and Grim Native, which is basically where tradition meets terror. And I'm from the Otoe-Missouria and Choctaw tribes, and I'm a she, her. And tonight I am wearing, well, I'm not wearing, I have black hair. I am wearing my Choctaw shirt, which has like the serpentine design, which I love being able to wear because it kind of showcases our Choctaw pottery design. And it's in like a hot pink and blue, and it's my favorite shirt right now. So that's about me.
Tali.
Hey, I'm Tali Inlow. I am a writer by night and a healthcare person by day. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm really excited to be here and talk all things spooky, folklore, the things that make us look over our shoulder at night. Thanks for having me.
Weyodi. Oh, you're mute. Your microphone's mute, Weyodi. Sorry. There you go.
I'm Weyodi, OldBear, and I'm a citizen of the Comanche Nation and a writer. I write comics, games, and prose, and work for the theater. And
that's so cool.
I'm dressed in black, and my hair is black, and my lipstick is a very dark brown.
So when Weyodi sent me her headshot, I fell in love with her lipstick color, and I actually bought it because it's a great color. And yes, it's awesome. Well, I am super excited to get this started. Tonight, you guys are going to be so educated. I hope that chat, if you guys have questions about stories, or if you hear folklore that you want to get some clarification on, let us know. We were having a great conversation about Dear Woman before we came on. So if you guys are curious, we can revive that too. But the icebreaker question for tonight is, who is your favorite monster or ghost in folklore or horror history? And we can go in the same order before Matt, Johnnie, Tali, Weyodi.
So if it's specifically a monster, I have always been a big fan of either the flying head, which is, I cannot remember how to say it in its proper original tribe language, or flying skeletons, which come from the Great Lakes because they can turn invisible and shoot people with poisoned arrows, and it's fantastic.
Awesome. Johnnie?
Well, that's a hard question because there's so many. I'm very fond of like the little people stories, because I lived in an area where they were very problematic, very mischievous, and there are certain things that I still like am mindful of, even though I live in LA now and don't really have to worry about little people. But also I'm a big fan of Aqua Naholu. Nahalu. Use my bad Choctaw. I'm still learning, but basically it translates to white people of the water. And they and it literally are like these kind of like fish people that will kind of grab you, drown you, and it's just one of my favorite monsters because just learning about folklore and learning about all these different figures, it's one that I didn't hear about until very recently.
Oh, is it the same? Oh my gosh, and I'm gonna get this wrong. The guy who, the director who wrote Pan's Labyrinth recently did one about folklore, and it's like, what is it called? But it is a creature that lives in the water and pulls them down. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
the
I'm
one
sorry.
with the fish. Oh my gosh, I
Yeah,
can't remember the name
it's
of
like
it. Yes.
Deep Water, or if you haven't seen it, you
The
definitely
color
should.
of water?
Color of Water.
Yes, The Color of Water. There you go.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah,
So good.
and I picture like the Aqua Naholos as the Pan's Labyrinth, like his vision, because they are said to have like the skin of trout. So
Oh,
that
you definitely need to watch
does
this
have
movie.
that same like imagery.
Yes, I think you would love it. It's a romantic, dark folklore. That's a good description.
When it comes to movies, it's hard to say it's folklore, but
I know. I'm
she
like,
does fall in love with the fish.
yeah.
But what is a movie?
That's pretty
but modern
folklore-ish.
folklore.
That's
It's
true.
modern folklore
So if
because we're folk.
Wait,
we
let's
can
get to the
certainly,
intro.
I would love to get into this conversation piece because there is a very loose definition of folklore that scholars have been arguing forever when it comes to folklore and folklorists. There has to be variation, and movies cannot produce variation except
we-
like.
But fan
What's that
fiction
song?
comes from movies, and that
We can be folkloric, but the movies cannot be folklore.
Tali, introduce yourself.
I'm
before this goes
gonna actually bring it back. Sorry if Kat's like fighting in the background too, but I'm gonna bring it back to movies because I'm a big fan of like anything that, I mean, like Little People aside, we call them skeelies, and those are like a big part of my childhood, and just being afraid of the woods at night, of being outside after dark or whatever. But when it comes to like monsters, I like anything that makes you like stop and think in an existential way. And I think sometimes like when we dig deeper into folklore and stories and the horrors of the things around us, like that's what's most interesting to me. And I'm gonna go with like a more modern horror movie. I'm gonna say The Babadook. I think that, first of all, he's a queer icon, and he's also this like physical manifestation of grief in a really cool way, about how he kind of like never goes away and he's always there, and you just kind of have to learn to live with this like monster in your basement. So I really like that. But anything that makes you kind of like want to dig deeper, I enjoy.
Oh man, yeah, that's a good one. Sorry, I had to, before we get too spicy, because I know that we're gonna get into this as soon as we get the intros open. Guys, this is like a carbonated soda waiting to pop. So
I also do want to mention that it's hilarious that our queer icon is like the manifestation of depression.
It just makes sense.
our journey.
Weyodi, talk to us about your favorite monster.
Well, I was thinking about this, and I was actually thinking about telling a flying head story later, but I'm neck and neck. I won't talk about the little people because I believe in them too hard to talk about them. I just want to say, if you're listening, little people, you have all my respect. I respect you deeply, and I'm not going to mention you again tonight. Okay. My favorite
Like
monster.
moving away from my bed. Okay.
No, and I was always told they came from space. Anyway, but my favorite monsters are, okay, I'm old, but I'm not, I mean, I'm old, so I can say Frankenstein and the Muppets.
Ooh,
And
the Muppets.
I grew up with the Muppets, hearing about the Muppets. And I don't know, you might say that the Muppets is a Comanche version of the Bigfoot, sort of. I mean, it kind of fits that general description, but one of the main things that they do when they take you, besides eating you and assaulting you, in a non-violent way, or in a violent way that,
It's so
is
cute.
they punish people for poor hygiene. Is the people they get are the people who they can smell, because I mean, I understand the social aspect of when you're in a small community and you're all traveling together, you really want to make sure, especially your teenage boys who I know they threatened with this a lot, that, you're going to get eaten, taken, and violated and eaten by a big, hairy people if you don't wash your behind, boy. So that's, they're all instructive. So
I did that. My grandmother, whenever I would brush my teeth and then eat something sweet after, that was my threat. Like every single time, you're going to have smelly breath. Your teeth are going to go bad. So many horrible things. Oh, man.
So I have a sort of affinity, and I do have a Bigfoot tale in the anthology of stuff.
That's awesome.
Oh, thank
so
God.
just
Thank God, because I was going to do a flying head story. I'm going to panic if I can't read it.
say from
I'll
where
do
I grew up
something
in the
else.
San Antonio area. Oh, yeah. Chupacabra, 100% will always be my favorite. Always. I would never go to the chicken coop at night or in the early mornings. Like, I just don't whistles at night. So let's get into the stories. We have a lot of people in chat who are super excited too. Everyone says hi. Everyone's shouting out for Bigfoot because this is the Pacific Northwest. Although I did read, one of the kiddos that I used to nanny was obsessed with like cryptoids. Like, he loves them. And I was super happy because he was 3, right? But he loved Bigfoot. And he had a book that I got him. And in the book, Bigfoot was a protector of the trees, which is the first time I've heard that story, that he protected the trees. I was like, I never really thought but it makes sense. Like, he could be the Lorax of the trees. Who knows? But let's get down. Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about the story you're reading and a little history about it?
So, I am going to be telling the Joseph Brockett version of the Flying Head, because it's well formulated and put together. Basically, it's this idea of always being prepared, always being ready, and taking care of yourself, and actually not panicking in stressful situations. So I will be reading the Flying Head. One day, long ago, a Mohawk woman was out gathering berries in the forest. She had traveled far from her lodge, with her baby strapped to her back. Her basket almost full, the woman had just turned to head home when she heard the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves overhead. As the sound got closer and closer, the woman soon realized it was the sound of a flying head. She looked up, and a chill went down her spine as she dropped the berries she had been picking. She could see the monster flying through the sky. She could see the gleam of its big, sharp teeth, a giant head with long, flowing hair and no body. It had 2 huge paws like those of a giant bear that stuck out from each side of its neck. The woman took a deep breath. She knew that she and her baby were in great danger. Flying heads had huge appetites. They were so greedy that they would eat just about anything in the forest, especially human beings. Although it had not seen her yet, through the thick branches of the trees, she knew that it was already following her scent. Soon it would fly down below the branches and follow her trail. She knew she would not be able to outrun it, and she feared for her life and the life of her baby. But she still was able to think fast. If the flying head was coming down from her, she would escape by going up. With her baby on her back, the woman quickly ran to a big pine tree. She leaped up to grab a branch above her head. pulled herself up and her baby up into the tree and began to climb. No sooner had she reached a high branch than the flying head came into view below. Flying through close to the ground, it sniffed madly through the leaves of the forest floor. Doing her best to be quiet, the woman watched from above as the flying head got closer and closer. Soon, it was directly below her, its face to the ground. The flying head quickly worked its way around the base of the tree. Her scent ended at the bottom of the tree. And the flying head was now confused. It never thought of looking up. It seemed as if it might just give up and go in pursuit of easier prey. But just as the flying head was about to move on, the woman's small child reached out for a pine cone on a nearby branch, pulling it loose. The cone, though, was too big for the child's tiny hand. It fell down, hitting several tree limbs on the way down and struck the monster right on top of its head. The flying head immediately looked up. When it spotted the woman and her child, the monster let out an ear-piercing scream. Roar! Like an arrow from a bow, the flying head shot up towards the woman. The woman thought they were about to be devoured. But in its fury, the head flew so fast that, bam, it smashed into a giant tree limb, knocking itself unconscious. As the monster fell to the ground below with a great thump, the woman quickly climbed down the tree and ran towards her lodge as fast as she could. Her baby still strapped to her back, but the woman knew it wouldn't be long before the flying head was back on her trail. Sure enough, all too soon, she heard its cry once again. Roar! Hearing its screams and the sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves grew closer and closer. The woman looked around. There was only one thing she could try now. She turned off the trail and entered a patch of thick brush and briars. Roar! The flying head screamed as it saw the woman picking her way through the brambles. Picking up speed, it crashed into the thick brush, only to find its hair completely tangled in the maze of branches and prickly briars. As it struggled to free itself, the flying head's hair became more and more tangled. Seeing this, the woman turned and ran as fast as she could towards her lodge. Totally exhausted, she finally reached the place in the forest where their longhouse stood in a small clearing. "Whoa," she called, but no one answered. She looked inside. Her husband had not returned yet from hunting. She looked back towards the forest. Seeing nothing following her, she breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that the flying head was no longer after her. Entering her lodge, the woman put her baby down beside the fire. Then she sat for a time with her eyes closed, catching her breath. They were alive. They had escaped that monster. As her breath slowed and she became calm, she realized how hungry she was. Having dropped the berries in the forest, she looked around the lodge for something that she and her baby could eat. Since her husband had not returned yet from hunting, all she could find was a handful of chestnuts. Sitting down in the center of her lodge, she took a stick and stirred the still burning coals of the fire, dropping the handful of chestnuts along the coals, then watched them carefully. Meanwhile, back in the forest, the flying head had freed itself and was back on the woman's trail. It followed her scent through the forest until it reached the small clearing where the lodge stood. Then the hungry monster flew up onto the roof and looked down into the lodge through the smoke hole. Unaware of the danger above her, the woman gently reached in among the coals. She pulled out one of the now roasted chestnuts, which looked like a blackened glowing coal. Breaking it open, she put it in her mouth. Looking down from the smoke hole above, the flying head was astonished. "What is this?" he thought. "Fire is good to eat. I must try some." Swooping down through the smoke hole, the flying head knocked the woman aside. It scooped up all of the glowing coals in its huge paws and greedily gulped them down. "Ah!" it screamed as the hot coals burned the inside of its mouth. With the gusts of smoke flowing from its mouth, the flying head shot up and out of the smoke hole. Away it flew, never to be seen again. So it was that the flying head was defeated by its own greed.
Love that. Okay, so before we start the next story, I do have to poke at this bear. Why, if they made that into a movie, would that not be folklore?
So the movie itself would not be folklore because it is
Okay.
a produced thing that is given to everybody the exact same way. There's no variation possible. The story, especially from an oral tradition, consistently goes through revisions. Everybody, including what you've heard about, like Deer Woman, for instance, has a different version of the Deer Woman story. That is where folklore comes into play, because that variation, that regional, that cultural, the whatever variation of the story, that's where the folk differences lie.
Oh.
A movie, it'll be reproduced forever and there's no changes possible. So it can't really, it's pretty rigid in its storytelling.
Weyodi, I know you want to say something. You can do it. Save our story voices. Johnnie, you ready?
I sure am. Well, I know we're talking about folklore, so the story that I'm going to tell is a story that we tell in my family quite a bit, and it's a true story. And we all know stories about dolls. And, you know, we have Chucky, we have Annabelle, we have all these stories about haunted dolls. And there's some very real truth to that. And it comes up in folklore. And in my family, one of the stories that we tell quite a bit is about something that happened when I was probably about 3 or 4. The only thing I really remember from the event itself is sitting in a car with my mom and my aunt and watching the house from a from a distance, and just seeing lights coming on in the house that we were living in. So, okay, let me just tell you guys this story. So way back in the day when I was just a little kid, I was about 3 or 4, we lived out in rural Oklahoma near Rainy Mountain, and we were close to Mountain View Godebo. And but we lived out in the middle of nowhere. And we lived in this house that I guess that had one time had been like was supposed to be like a governor's mansion or a mayor's mansion, and it was super run down. And so we got to move in pretty cheap. But in the house, it was my grandparents, it was me and my mom, it was my uncle and his wife, and we all lived in this house together. And my uncle Mike was married to a woman who was Hopi, and her grandma had passed away, and they were going to the funeral. My aunt decided to go with them, and they were going all the way to Colorado from Oklahoma. And there had been some things happening. This house had a lot of things. It had issues. When you talk about a haunted house, it was this house. I'm sure of it. Because they would see cars driving through the driveway, but there'd be no cars. My grandma would stay home quite a bit by herself, and she would hear footsteps. She would hear people talking, but there would be nobody there. Several times they would see a little girl in the house. And also, let me tell you a weird thing about this house. When we first moved in, they were going around making sure everything was cleaning up the yard and everything. They noticed a window in the basement, and you could see into a room. There was a bed, there was a nightstand, a TV. But when you went down into the basement where that room was supposed to be, it was all bricked off. There was no entrance to that room except for the window outside the house. So, like I said, creepy house. And nobody had lived into it, and nobody has lived in this house since we left.
Chad is saying nope.
Yeah, there's a lot of notes, which explains why we got it so cheap. But so my aunt, my uncle, they headed to Oklahoma for the funeral. And while they were there, my aunt started having these dreams about these feathers that were dancing. And at first there were 7 feathers. And every time she had these dreams, one of the feathers would fall. And the night that they got to Colorado, they were going through the funeral, and my aunt went to sleep, and she said, you know, at that time, she goes, there were only 4 feathers left. And she goes, and one by one, they started dropping. And then till finally there was just one feather that was just dancing. And she didn't know what it meant. She said, you know, it didn't feel like ominous. They were just like these feathers dancing. The last feather fell, and she woke up, and there was a woman standing by the door, and it was an elder woman. And she was telling my aunt, you know, I want to thank you for taking good care of my granddaughter. You know, I appreciate what you've done for her, but you need to go home now. And my aunt's like, what? And she's like, you need to leave now. She goes, you need to go home. And so at that point, my aunt woke up and she realized like it was part of her dream, but she was so bothered by it that she went and talked to my uncle. And she's like, I have a really bad feeling. She goes, and I think we need to go now. And, and he's like, well, what happened? Why do you feel we have to go? And he told her about it. And, his wife was like, well, who was the old woman? And she described her, and it was the grandma who passed away. And so they got in the car and they headed back to Oklahoma. Now, the thing about my family is I grew up old school Pentecostal. So we would have church meetings in our house. My grandpa would oftentimes have like visiting preachers come over and they would have church service in our house. And it just so happened that they were having one of these services and they were taking a break and they were eating. And my Uncle David and his wife, were not very churchy. And they were kind of staying up in my uncle's room at the time while they were gone. And, of course, us kids were playing and everything was going good. But then my aunt, Marilyn, came running down and she was telling them, you need to come and help. He's choking. My uncle started choking. And when they went into the room, they were like trying to figure out like, why is he choking? What's going on? And he kept pointing. And they finally looked to where he was pointing, and there was a doll just sitting on a shelf, and it was laughing at them. And they had weird things about this doll before, but they kind of just brush it off, like the feeling of being watched, but the doll was actually laughing. And as this was happening, my aunt and uncle arrived back from Colorado just as this all started going down. And so they get in the house and, everybody's dealing with my uncle. So they rush in. And at that time, my grandpa and there were like 2 other preachers who were there were just like, okay, you guys need to get the kids and you need to take them out of the house. And nobody was saying anything that was going on. My aunt just, they all just got in from Colorado. They drove straight through. And so they gather up all the kids that were there. They put us in the car and it was my aunt and my mom, and they just drive us out to the road, which is probably I'd say a good quarter mile away from the house. And I remember just being in the car and we were just watching the house. And while we were out there on the road, my grandpa and the other preachers, my Uncle Mike, were getting this doll, and they put it in a bag and they took it outside and they put it into this barrel and they set it on fire and they started praying over this doll. And while they were praying, this doll was literally in this bin burning and screaming. And then all of a sudden they said the light flashed in the fire. And then in the house, it was like a spirit was trying to find somewhere else to go. So all the lights in the house, like it was moving through the house, the lights would come on one by one by one. And that's all that I remember as a kid, was just sitting in the car and watching the lights come on, like somebody was just going through the house, turning the lights on and off, on and off. And that's what I remember. And finally, everything kind of winded down and the doll was gone. They prayed over the house. They came out, they prayed over the kids. And, of course, my aunt was telling them, like, they were like, why are you guys back? Like, we weren't expecting you. And my aunt was telling them, about these dreams that she was having. She goes, that last feather fell. And she goes, and, this woman told me that, we needed to go home. She goes, so we came back, and that they got there just as everything was going down. Now, you kind of would think that's where the story would end, but we kind of think not, because all through our lives, there have been these incidents involving dolls. And sometimes you could kind of think of it as trauma. But I have another memory from that same house of me and my cousin playing in a room. And I had this clown doll, and it had one of those, I know I'm dating myself here, but it was one of those dolls that had the pull string that would laugh, or it would say, like, I'm your friend. But we had one of those dolls. And all I remember is that we were sitting there playing, and the doll started talking to us without us pulling the string. And it was saying things that we shouldn't be hearing as kids. But I remember us taking the doll and throwing it in this little closet, because this house was old. They used to have like these closets where you would put the laundry into. So they were like small doors and they had little locks on them. And I remember us putting the doll in there. And for a while, like, I would have these recurring nightmares about that doll. And I always thought it was just a dream, like a bad dream, because I'm terrified of clowns. And I never really knew where that came from. My cousin is also scared of clowns. But I was telling my aunt, and he just happened to be there while I was telling my aunt about this dream. And he's like, wait a second. He's like, I had that same dream too. And we were both like, what? And I was creeping out. And, you know, we kind of left it at that. And then a couple of years ago, I was going through some of my old photos on Facebook, and I realized I have a picture of me around the same age that I would have been with that clown doll sitting in the background. And I was like, oh, hell no. And, you know, and it continues, because you would think that it would end there, but no. So not too long ago, my sister called me in the middle of the night, and she's like, Jay, she's like, you know, I needed to call you because I feel like something's going to happen, like something's coming to you, because it was bothering us. She goes, and I had, you know, our pastor come out and pray, and she goes, but I just got this strong feeling it's going to mess with you now. And my mom passed away, and you're supposed to burn everything, get rid of everything, but we didn't really do that because it was just really traumatic. And so, you know, we did keep things just sentimental, you know, they meant something to us, so we kept them. But my sister had this doll that my mom had kept for a long time. And my mom had a really strange attachment to this doll. Like, she would sometimes treat that doll better than she would treat us. And there was an incident involving police where a boyfriend stole the teddy bear, and she called, and they thought it was a kid that was being kidnapped, not a teddy bear. But, you know, that's just to show you how attached she was to this bear. But that was one of the things that was kept. But my sister was saying, like, her girls were scared of something in the closet, you know, and something just kept bothering her girls. And she goes, and she would just try to ignore it. But my niece Lexi, during the pandemic, of course, was going to school online. And so she said, you know, she had just set up Lexi with her school in the living room, and she had her two youngest girls in the bathtub. So she was going back and forth checking on them. And as soon as she got done with Lexi, she went to go to the bathroom. And she said when she looked in the bathroom, you know, she could see her girls, but out of the corner of her eye, her girl's room was right off to the side of the bathroom. She said she saw a girl sitting on the bed, and she was like, when Lexi get that dress? And then she was like, but Lexi's in the living room. So she stepped back, because their house wasn't big, to look in their living room, and Lexi's still at the computer. And when she looked back in, the little girl was still there. But when she went to walk into the room, the little girl was gone. And they kept having troubles with this girl. And even before she passed, my mom had constantly seen a little girl in her apartment. And so we feel like now that whatever spirit was bothering my aunt, you know, in the first story with the doll, that it had kind of been following the family in some way or another and finding a way to attach. And we think it attached to the doll that my mom had. Because when they did burn the doll, it was an old teddy bear. So you would think that thing would light up and go like nothing. It took over 8 hours for the bear to burn. The pastor took it out at midnight, and he was like, you know, we were sitting out and we thought it was just going to set it on fire, because they burned the doll. They also burned a backpack that had some of my mom's clothes in it. And those went up right away, but the teddy bear took a while to burn. And, you know, and my pastor was saying, you know, like, I think we're going to have to come and pray. He goes, because I don't really think this is over. And sure enough, you know, my sister, you know, has still had problems with that. But when she called me, you know, I went to the living room, because we're already in bed. And when I walked out of the living room from hanging up to her to tell my partner kind of what was going on, all I see is him racing towards our door and slamming it shut. And I'm like, what the heck? And he tells me that he was up, and he goes, he goes, like, I felt like something was going to happen. He goes, and, you know, I heard you talking to your sister. He goes, but then I heard the door rattle. And he goes, and the door started opening, and he just jumped out of bed. He was like, I was already primed, like I expected it to happen. And he shut the door. And so we had, you know, like, I called my aunt because she's a minister, and I had her praying with us over our apartment. I had sage, we had Palo Santo, we were burning. And there was one spot in our bathroom where we could not keep anything lit. The stage, the smoke wouldn't smoke, the Palo Santo, nothing would stay in the bathroom. Like there was just this one spot. And it was really weird because there was also like this little path where it felt like electricity, like where it felt like when you'd walk through that area, like you'd get goosebumps and your hair would kind of stand up. And it was a really weird thing. And we, you know, we kind of figured, okay, my aunt prayed, we done this, we got over it. The next night I used to do scary stories on Twitter Spaces. And I was doing an interview with Mike Marin, and we had a studio space. And while I was in there, the door popped open on me. Like, and I figured somebody was sitting on our stoop smoking. And so like I got up, I went out there, I closed the door, and I was like, there's nobody out here. I was like, what the heck? So I locked the door, and I was like, wait, I always have this door locked. So I thought maybe my partner had tried to come in and forgot something. And so like I kind of brushed it off. And we went back to talking, and you know, Mike was telling stories, and all of a sudden, like I hear somebody say, hey, hello. And I turn and I'm looking around like, what the heck? But it sounded like somebody was right there behind me. And I was like, what the heck? And then again, I hear the door rattle. So I go thinking, you know, it's my partner and he's trying to come in. So I get up and I go and I look out and there's nobody there. And I am like, what the heck at this point? And I'm thinking maybe somebody's messing with me. And I go to look out the bathroom window towards the back area of the studio space. And I'm standing there and I'm still on Twitter Spaces. I have my phone I'm carrying around with me, you know, and given the appropriate, and I'm standing there looking out the window and I feel something just like breathe and it actually moves my hair. And I'm like, oh, heck no. And at that point, you know, I bring it up to Twitter and I'm like telling them what's going on. I'm like, hey guys, you know, I'm going to have to cut this short. There's some things going on here. I don't know what's going on, but I don't want to stay here. So I ended our little session like really fast. And I called my partner and I was like, hey, you're going to have to come get me because I'm scared. And, you know, we didn't smoke off the studio space because we really didn't think we had to or anything after my sister called. Like this was directly the next day. And before he even got back there, I was already out. I didn't even bother turning the lights or anything off. I don't even remember locking the door. I just left because there was such a weird feeling in there. Like I was being watched and I couldn't take it. Like I just left and I met him halfway. He's like, what's going on? And I was telling him, and we didn't go back to the studio space for like 2 days after. And when we did, you know, I went back and we smoked and prayed over everything. But we have like this haunted history of dolls in our family. And so like, I'm very weary. Like when people talk about dolls, you know, there is like a lot of folklore that is attached to that and where that comes from. It's rooted in a lot of folklore, you know, puppets, even them, you know, there's these very cultural roots that get attached. And, you know, we have these stories in my family of dolls. And it's a constant in our family, like experiences with dolls that have spirits attached to them. But, you know, also like in our tribal beliefs, like, you know, we have like corn husk dolls. And when you make a corn husk dolls, you're told not to put a face to it because then you're giving it a spirit. You're giving it a voice and a way, an entrance, an invitation. And there's a lot of things that you don't do. But of course, when you look at dolls we have now, they all have faces. They all have, you know, like a personality even to an extent. And when you get into puppets, don't even get me started on puppets. I've had some very creepy experiences, and one was with a very popular native puppet man. And let me tell you, I remember him in high school coming to my school, and I busted out crying, and people made fun of me. But I was so traumatized by his puppet shows. Like there was just something not right about those puppets to me. And then I started working at a summer camp and they were like, oh, we have a guest coming in to perform. And I'm all happy. And they're like, Johnnie, can you go help him get his stuff and bring it up to the stage? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Who was it? The same puppet man. And his puppets were staying the night in our camp. Let me tell you, that night I did not sleep. And I was just, every noise I heard, I just knew it was one of his puppets coming to get me. But there's a history with that. So that's one of the stories I wanted to share with you tonight because I think that's something of part of folklore that we don't hear is a lot of the personal experiences, but also knowing like these popular monsters that we have, whether it's Chucky or Annabelle, those stories are rooted in folklore.
So, I also don't do dolls because as a little girl, my grandmother, and I don't know why she did this, she would go visit her family and she was from Mexico and she would bring me back it was like a doll clown head in just a jar. And we lived in a trailer and they put it on my dresser because I had a small room and it was right across from my bed. And then slowly they started buying these creepy white face glass dolls and she would put them right there across from my bed, and we already lived across from about like a graveyard. So I was really just not having, and I to this day I don't have dolls. I don't do the doll thing. I don't do it. I don't do dolls in heads or in jars or anything. And I asked my grandmother, like, I was like, Mamu, why did you give me those? And she was just like, protection. And that's all she was saying. I was like, I guarantee you I did not feel protected when I was a little girl.
Girl, no.
You're like, that felt like a threat.
I was like, I know I'm not your favorite, but no.
Well, now I'm gonna look at my kachinas a little differently now.
Thank you for that wonderful story, Johnnie. Tali, do you want to do yours?
All I can say is I'm on the East Coast over here. It is like dark outside. These are good vibes for spooky season. That's what I'll say. Oh my gosh. So I wanted to tell, I actually wrote a very short story for this. And a little bit of background is that like I grew up hearing stories about the legends, not just Cherokee legends, but also the real life people up and down the roads near us, the people who were part of this innate like folklore in the area where we grew up. And my dad had a lot of stories and I couldn't possibly tell all of them, but some of the recurring themes that were big in stories he would tell were things about medicine, um, bad medicine, and curses and having to have those curses lifted and things like that. And so the story that I wrote is inspired by a real life like object, artifact, talisman, whatever you want to call it, that we found on our farm. So it's set on the farm where I grew up. And this was on a land allotment that, came from my great grandfather, who came to Indian territory on the Trail of Tears and got this, 60 acres for signing his name on a piece of paper. And that's where this is set. And the object that I describe in here is like a real thing that we found. But yeah, I'll go ahead and read the story and then we'll go from there. She walks alone in grass, down the hill into the valley that they call the bottom. Once there, she sees a tree. Not an unfamiliar tree, no, but one that had seen 3 generations of her family before her stand in this very spot. To the north, a hillside where even now the musical tinkle of fresh spring water drips along, unceasing and never ending, as long as old promises are kept. Water sweet and life-giving. To the south, Honey Creek, fed from many gentle and small tributaries such as this one on her land. To the west, her mother's family homestead, and to the east, her father's. The tree that has seen 3 generations stands alone, and she moves towards it. The palm of her hand shields her eyes from the noonday sun, and she squints into the low branches of the crooked, gnarled thing. Something glints, twisting in the light summer breeze. As she approaches, she wonders how it's managed to grow this way, why its branches have split and dipped and hung heavy but never broken, not fully. As she approaches, she wonders why her restlessness had brought her down to this valley in the first place. But the tree does not give her any answers, just more questions, because something unfamiliar hangs from its limbs. Strange. Bones? Yes, but that's not all. A sinuous material hard from the sun, a feather, a small stone, like a mobile dangling above a baby's crib, oddly balanced in its out-of-place way. She blinks up at it, unmoving. Questions abound. Who put it there? Why and how? This bottom is isolated, unvisited in over a year since it's mostly grazing land. They didn't even cut hay down here anymore. No one in her family would have put this here, this silly little thing. Because that's what it is, isn't it? Just some silly little thing. She takes it down because she wants to show someone, anyone really. Look at this silly thing, she will say. This silly little
Oh, Tali, we can't hear you.
Sorry, Mike. Did I come back on? Okay, cool. I can't hear you. I don't know where I
Oh yeah.
broke.
Sorry, you're at silly little thing.
Silly little thing, because that's what it is, isn't it? Some silly little thing. She takes it down because she wants to show someone, anyone really, look at this silly thing. She'll say, this silly little thing that I found hanging up in a tree down in the bottom. As she climbs the steep hill home, her footsteps feel heavier and heavier, surely then, because of the exertion and nothing else. Don't be silly, she thinks to herself. Silly. The word begins to lose meaning. When she reaches her front step, the woman realizes that she's barely been touching this silly thing, the talisman, the ward, nonsense from someone trespassing or playing a prank. The very top edge of a bit of sinew and old twine is pinched between her thumb and forefinger, and she feels her body pushing away from it. She decides to leave it on top of a rack of wood just outside the door. She looks at it suspiciously now, this silly little thing, suddenly not so silly at all, almost glaring at it as she leaves it outside. The thing stays outside, and she enters the house, but she does not enter alone. The end.
That was really good.
Thank you, thank you.
That's
It's
awesome.
it's like one of those things that I don't know, it just makes me think so strongly of my dad and him telling stories and things like that, and just that feeling of knowing that anything is kind of possible, and thinking of it as maybe it's something silly, and maybe it's not so silly at all.
I wasn't allowed to bring things that I found because you would find like arrowheads and stuff like just in that part. I wasn't allowed to bring anything that I found like that inside the house. Like, just wasn't allowed. So I never did. Like, we kept all our skulls, even like for stuff that we made barbacoa with, like all of that. It never came back in the house. It was now I know for good reason. Oh, Weyodi, it's your turn. Unmute. Unmute.
I keep doing it. I was like, now remember to unmute yourself, Weyodi. And then of course I didn't. I've been trying to figure out, I'm like, should I read something? Should I tell a story? Because I have to explain, I was raised by old people, and in the early 70s, when I was a little girl, my grandmother was my age and I lived with her, and she used to take me down to the Comanche Elderly Center and record on reel-to-reel stories of the elders who were really old. If you were hanging out you were from before 1900, a lot of these people. And I learned to drink black coffee with them at the age of 3. And I have a lot of weird, so I was like, should I read? And I was like, but I really wanted to tell the head story because it was a girl story about a couple of girls who were warriors. And then I was like, well, I guess I think I might read. So I'm going to take off my glasses because I can't read with my glasses on. And this is the shortest story I had, because we had talked about which one to read. I had talked to you, Jfun, about that. So I was like, so here we go.
I'm excited.
Noel Hunt's Wild Ride. I should begin by stating for the record, I am a garden variety neurotic. And I should know, I both work and study in the field. Toil is more like it. I toil in the fields as a mental health tech at the state hospital. That's how I earn my daily bread. Meanwhile, pursuing my license as a clinical psychologist and seeing patients as an unpaid intern as part of the state licensing requirements. So I may or may not have ever had an impulse I haven't vivisected, but I can guarantee I don't imagine things. I am firmly grounded in reality. Even my own therapist says so. Therapy is a licensing requirement too. So as I was saying, there's no way I imagine what happened. To start with, it wasn't the most picturesque haunted house. There were avocado green appliances in the kitchen, and I was willing to bet dollars to donuts in the bedroom. Pinhole dappled posters of Casey and the Sunshine Band were fluttering over bare mattresses. A 1970s style aesthetic nightmare, but not exactly setting off the old spookometer. But then things are rarely picturesque in real life. I should explain this part. I have to admit, it's weird of me, but I rarely have enough days off during the holidays to visit my family, who inconveniently live on a res on the other side of the country. I mean, Christmas alone is pathetic enough for people who didn't happen to be born on the day. So I developed this, I guess it's a tradition, something to do to keep occupied and not feeling too sorry for myself. I go ghost hunting on Christmas. None of that high-tech stuff for me. I'm strictly a bell, book, and candle guy. Cedar and a Bic lighter, traditional to my tribe, wrapped up in some tinfoil in case of heavy-duty emergencies. Not to mention that that's all I can afford. Besides, it wasn't like I believed in ghosts. Not for real. Not that I disbelieve either. It's a complicated question, you know? I got my undergrad degree in anthropology, but there was no real pathway for what I wanted to study. Modern, mainstream, American white people. None of my advisors seemed to understand that there was a mystery there to unravel, so I switched to clinical psychology. The pay was, or maybe in the future will be, better. Plus, I still have the white mind to try to figure out. But like I was saying, real life is rarely picturesque. For example, despite the similarities at first glance, the figure looming over me roughly 3 minutes after I entered the haunted house could in no way be described as a right jolly old elf. He was taller than me by at least half a head, and I'm the muscle back on the locked ward, with a long unkempt beard, a painted buckskin coat warred with his massive gut, but it wasn't the gut of a gentle, sedentary life. He made me think of an old biker with scarred knuckles and sheer muscle under that fat from too much beer and too much ham. The smell of tobacco, leather, and malt liquor floated around him like an aura. For an instant, I caught a whiff of a not so nice animal smell underneath. Don't tell me I'm on the naughty list again, I said, trying to alleviate the obvious tension of two strangers meeting late at night in what appeared to be an abandoned house. Obviously, I was trespassing, but so was he. So, yeah. The figure from the answered from under his fur hood, stomping the snow from his boots. A few illegal downloads, a few minor traffic violations. You're small potatoes on the naughty list, Noel. How do you know my name? I asked. It was the obvious question. The guy went on stomping. I know a lot of things. Who are you? I asked, at a loss for anything else to say. I am, the figure asked, throwing back his hood to reveal an unruly mane of white hair to match the beard. I knew who he looked like in a skewed, off-kilter, rugged kind of way. You don't expect me to believe you're Santa Claus, do you? I mean, I suppose I could go the old I am known by many names route, but Santa's definitely one of them, the figure said. So you can use Santa. Nick works too. You expect me to believe that? I went ghost hunting on Christmas Eve and accidentally ran into Santa Claus? I said. When do you expect to see me? St. Patrick's Day? I promise you, that guy does not live up to his holiday. What a stiff, the figure who could not possibly be Santa Claus said. It was then that I realized the stranger was missing an eye. The socket stared ahead, shrunken, red, puckered. Can you give me one good reason to believe you? I said, willing myself to be suspicious, willing myself not to stare at the hole where his eye should have been. My heart skipped a beat, remembering that most folklorists consider Santa to be the modern, defanged version of Odin, who just so happened to be short an eye. The big man shrugged. Doesn't matter whether you believe or not. Most people can't even see me. Is that a fact? I said in the voice I usually reserve for patients trying to pull a fast one, or in the case of most of the ward's Halidol victims, a slow one. Yes, it is, the man said distractedly. Usually I can come and go, and all people have is a vague feeling, maybe a phantom smell. The big man cast his eye in all the dark corners. I must be in the wrong room. The wrong room? I asked. The look I got made it clear the big-bellied buckskin figure had no intention of dignifying that with a response. What are you doing in an abandoned house on Christmas Eve? I asked, but it was too late. Santa Claus had turned on the heel of his biker boots and was bounding up the stairs. I had no choice but to go after him. For a big man with that kind of girth, he moved with surprising speed. So how come I can see you, Santa? I called as I took the stairs 2 at a time in an attempt to catch up with the towering figure. I'm not sure, a low voice ahead of me answered. Perhaps it's because you keep Christmas better than most. Ha ha ha, I answered. It was the first thing he'd got wrong so far, but man, did he get it wrong. Why is that funny? He said. I think you do, and I would know. But I don't, I protested, keep Christmas at all. Santa came to a stop at the top of the stairs and met me face to face. Let's see. Since your girlfriend left you, you spent every Christmas in haunted houses, just like this one, searching for lost souls. Every day you search and you search, like Ariadne with her ball of yarn, trying to find the lost and bring them out of the dark. Who knows? Maybe someday you may even find a soul of your own. I forced myself to laugh again, but it felt like a punch in the gut. I'm not lost, I insisted. If you don't know you're lost, Noel Hunt, how are you ever going to find your way home? Your grandma doesn't have many Christmases left, Santa said. How do you? I said, not wanting to believe him, but knowing that it was true. He sees you when you're sleeping, he sang in a lush baritone. He knows when you're awake. Oh, right, because you're, I said, rolling my eyes. Santa, yes, Santa said before continuing. He knows when your roommate's sister asked if you wanted anything for Christmas, your first thought was to ask her to sit on your face. My mouth shot open to protest, but before I could speak, behind me came a great black flapping of wings and a rush of cold air. I felt my feet begin to slide out from under me. I would have fallen down the stairs if the big man hadn't reached out and grabbed me by the shirt. 2 young men, unremarkable except for how ragged and frayed their hoodies were, like feathers almost, suddenly stood on either side of me. Forethought, retrospect, the big man said solemnly. If you'd been here on time, I wouldn't have wound up in the wrong room. Of course not, I said, as if the conversation hadn't moved on, as if any of this made any sense. Santa Claus conquers the Martians, Santa said. Make time to watch it with her. I think she'd get a kick out of it. She who? I asked, even more confused. You ask a lot of questions, Noel, and I don't have time to answer any more of them. My duties await, and contrary to legend, I work every night of the year, the big man said tiredly. What duties are those? I asked, because somehow I knew he wasn't talking about delivering toys. Instead of answering, the big man walked away, seeming older by the moment, opening a door that seemed to barely hang on its hinges. There you are, Santa said under his breath. I peeked around the door frame. Inside the room, huddled against the corner, was a tiny girl, somewhere between the ages of 5 and 7. Her hair was muddled blonde, both unwashed and unbrushed. Silver duct tape crisscrossed her pink puffy jacket. Tanya's mother's out turning tricks, Santa said, but she's never done it before. She's hoping she can rent a hotel room for the night, buy the girl a decent meal, maybe a toy. She left her here to keep her safe. I nodded. As I was saying, Noel, she isn't a professional. She has no idea what she's doing. She's got less street smarts than a pigeon. She won't be coming back for Tanya. No one will, Santa said with such finality that I shivered. Why not, I asked. Because she's dead, Santa said. I can call, I said, reaching for my phone. No need, Santa said. What are you? I gasped as Santa lifted the girl in one huge hand. She was still curled up like a kitten, more like the carved figure of a child than a living human being. With the other hand, Santa opened the great black trash bag slung over his shoulder, like some horrible parody of all the Christmas images I had ever seen in my life, spreading its terrible maw wide for the sleeping girl. The moment of clarity came too late for me. A vortex made of 2 ravens headed my way, and in my fear and stupidity and desperation, I lunged headfirst into the sack. I hadn't really paid any attention to the sack before, but now that I was inside it, it seemed to contain all of space and time. As my body continued to fly forward, I saw stars, but not the kind usually associated with a blow to the head. The every night out the window kind of stars, but somehow with more depth than I've ever seen before, as if before me stretched infinity. I glanced over my shoulder only to see the rapidly closing mouth of the sack was rimmed with gold. How had I missed that? Where had I gotten the impression it was a plastic trash bag? Because that was what the missionary Santa brought presents in when I was a kid. I saw somehow every Christmas of my life falling towards me at once. Missionaries and my grandma and aunties and girls I'd kissed, all without separation or delineation. The chaos overtook me. I screamed. It took some time before I was able to make sense of anything that was happening. There was hot fur in my face and calls from all around me, deafening and angry. At first, I was unable to sort them out, but then I realized they were the shouts of hunters, the barking of dogs. I was clinging to the back of a great shaggy reindeer, but a bigger, fatter, more menacing reindeer than I ever knew existed. The sound of its hooves rang out like an angry bell. The foam that flew from its nostrils was searing. I looked through the massive horns. The mob of hunters was huge and motley. Some rode reindeer like me, while others sat astride donkeys and horses, even ostriches and swans. Toward the front, the most beautiful white woman I'd ever seen in my life rode a spotted hog the size of an elephant, and white women usually don't do a thing for me. It struck me that it was like a merry-go-round, only live, only dangerous beyond description, only insane in purely clinical terms. Sure enough to relax my death grip on Blitzen, I craned my neck. Santa was at the head of the pack on a huge spotted horse that no matter how hard I looked, no matter how much I squinted and strained my eyes, looked to have more legs than any horse ought to have. I willed the beast I rode forward, urging her toward old Nick at the front of the group. It was a strange sensation, almost as if the animal had become my legs. My heart beat hard and heavy in my chest when I realized we were chasing something real. I caught sight of the stag 2 horses' length beyond the snapping dogs just as I came within reach of Santa's steed, but he vanished again into the distance. Tanya sat on Santa's lap between his belly and the neck of the terrifying animal he rode, but she didn't seem afraid at all. No, she laughed out loud, gleeful and shrill, the sound so sharp it rose for a second above the din of the hunt. Then she clapped her hands. Santa turned to me. In that instant, his face was no longer the face I had seen before. What faced me now was a death's head wrapped in creased and weathered skin, wrecked yellow teeth like broken piano keys, smiling directly at me. His one good eye was held open by hooks. Tanya beamed beatifically. "Merry Christmas, Noel," the low voice said. Out of sheer terror, I raced ahead of the hunt. I came for the shortest of seconds inside of the deer. Bambi's old man didn't have anything on the sky. He shone with a light I had only ever seen attributed to gods and saints, but never to an animal before. He was the truest, purest example of majesty I had ever seen. I found myself bewildered in the face of the stag, though he was lost to my sight again in the seconds that it took for the rest of the hunt to catch up with me. Again, I surged forward on my reindeer, but this time it was not effortless, and it was not a matter of seconds. It seemed to take hours to struggle to break from the pack and catch sight of the hart again. As I did, as I finally broke free, I saw in a twinkling something I could not believe. The hart had transfigured and become my grandma in her tracksuit and her leopard print house shoes with her tiny gold cross dangling at her throat. She looked at me with all the keen intelligence at her disposal, and even the power of thought left me. In a flicker, it was the hart who stood before me once more, but a hart that was also a man, standing on two legs with a mind and a dignity that was both human and animal. I knew it was a holy thing, the first real holy thing I had ever seen in my life. Before my eyes, the hart reverted to his four-legged form, but his will, his power, his thought remained unchanged. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt strangely calm. The sound of hooves and hounds and screams reached out behind me. I stepped off my mount to realize that all this time I had been flying, the deer running on air. Behind me, little Tanya let loose her banshee scream of joy. I surrendered to gravity, to the will of the heart. I tore open my shirt. He could gore me if he wanted. Let me fall to my death through infinite space. It didn't matter. I was his. What was I looking for? What had I been looking for all these years? White people be damned. It didn't matter if I understood them. It didn't matter. I was the heart's to do with as he would. I stepped toward the hart through the air. He lowered his head and caught my chest with his antlers. He raised his head, and I was airborne. I came to in the county jail, which was a bitch, since I had to work on the 26th. I had the worst headache of my life, and 2 of the reddest eyes I had ever seen were staring at me, and that was plenty. "Who was it, dude?" The skinny blonde crackhead, who was the only other person in the cell, said to me. "NSA? CIA? FEMA?" It was all I could do to squint back at him. Answering wasn't in my repertoire at the moment. "McDonnell Douglas? Time Warner?" he asked, pulling at my arm. "Dude, are you all right?" I had to say something. I guessed it was that or the guy would never leave me alone. "What, no Merry Christmas?" "Whoever fucked you up, they must have used some primo shit because they fucked you up right. You snored all the way through the holiday, dude," he said. "Knocked out and banged up. That's the way they found you. It's past Christmas, past New Year's, January 6th, if you really want to know." I scrubbed my face with my hands. "January 6th? Well, I guess that's better than knocked up and banged out, I guess." The crackhead rolled his eyes at my joke. Even crackheads have standards, I suppose. "So what happened to you? Word is they found you passed out in an abandoned house on 4th and Holly with a froze to death kid," he asked. If I claimed to know for sure, I'd be lying, I said, against my better judgment. "But what happened, man?" the crackhead said. "I think I took a ride with St. Nick," I said. The crackhead only stared in reply. I checked my forehead for a hoof mark. For some reason, I keep waiting for the short kid to come out and say, "God bless us, everyone," but I think that's probably the wrong story, I said. "God damn us, everyone," the crackhead said with a smile. "That's the spirit," I said. knowing that whatever I told my court-appointed attorney, it was not going to be the truth.
Wait, that was so good.
That was so good.
That was the entire range of amazing.
Yes.
Thank
I'm glad
you.
you chose that story because I don't celebrate Christmas. That was like, I can tell people why now.
I wish too to study the white people. I wish to understand.
That had me dying. I was like, isn't that the whole point of all of this?
So, you know,
we all
was
want
like,
that. This is amazing. Thank you all.
and that was the shortest one I had. I felt like it was entirely too long, but it was the shortest.
No, it was perfect. It was totally perfect. Like I said, like there wasn't really like a time limit. I just wanted everyone to get a story out. If chat has any questions, come up with some questions. But if we can, before 8:30, I wanted to just kind of touch on Dear Woman and what we talked about before panel started, because I thought that was really interesting. So if Johnnie, you can give like the background, and then like we can talk about like the different, I mean, because I think that is one where every depending on your region is a little bit different.
Yeah, so before we got started here, we were talking about how, for me, like I think one of the biggest cultural shifts in folklore is Dear Woman, because I grew up with her being not a heroic figure or a good figure, but something that should be feared and, you know, kind of respected in a lot of ways. Where to the point where you know, there's places in Oklahoma where, you know, you're told if you're driving at night, you don't look out the side of your windows. But you know, but it changes because, you know, I'm Otoe-Missouria and Choctaw. So the Otoe side of me has always been kind of like the bad Dear Woman. The Choctaw side of me, we have Dear Man and Dear Woman. And the Dear Man is kind of more or less harmless. Like he doesn't mess with people. If you wrong him, he will scare off your hunt, or, you know, he'll warn your enemy that you're coming. You know, little things like that, but he doesn't really like, he's not bad. And Dear Woman for the Choctaws is also more of like a seductress. Like if you're a person who is easily led astray, then yes, she will harm you by leading you away. Or if you're a cheating man, she'll make you fall in love and you'll just die of lovesick. So there's like a big cultural shift that we see, you know, and we see it especially in Reservation Dogs, if you're a fan, where Dear Woman is kind of like a heroic figure who goes after bad men and is a protector of women. And where we started that shift was with an anthology that was published by Native Realities to raise awareness about the murdered and missing Indigenous women, where we had a lot of our storytellers reclaim that narrative of Dear Woman and reimagine it as a protector of women. And since then, we've really seen a cultural shift in how people view Dear Woman as more of a good figure rather than a bad one.
And I was, I mean, in this conversation, I was saying, you know, as a Comanche person, I was brought up, I always heard women didn't have anything to fear from Dear Woman. And really, it was men, and men who were susceptible to looking for strange women, you know, easily led men were, and that, you know, men who were not so
A little
easily
loose
led
with their
astray were not
actions.
we're not in so much danger. But it was really, you know, that was how I was always heard growing up. And it's funny how things do spread like that, though. I mean, I just want to make other Comanches stop saying "aho." No one ever said that when I was growing up, and now young people say it, and I'm like, no. And I'm old and crotchety, so I can go, stop it.
Well, it trips me out when women say it too, because for us, you know, we don't say "aho." It's in our language. but for women, we say aha. So it's kind of like we're surprising you a little bit, you know?
We have
And I think that's why women choose to say aho, because otherwise you get confused. You got Native women just being like, aha, you know?
No, I mean, we say Morawe, but I mean, that's one person. Moraweka would be for like a group of people, and Morawe book for two people. But it's, but a lot of people don't do that. And they go, young people will go, oh, and I go, oh, now get off my lawn. Get off my linguistic lawn. So.
Well, I think that's one of the kind of like the cool things too, is like when we're talking about like folklore and, especially like culture, like we've seen it spread so fast in different ways and kind of change so quickly, especially now with like social media, because we're so much more connected to each other. Because I tripped out back in like the early 2000s when I moved from Oklahoma to New Mexico. And, like I grew up in the powwow trail and, like in our traditions and everything. And there's a certain way you enter the arena. There's a certain way you exit. There's certain things that you do. But then you go out to places where powwows weren't really part of their culture, but adopted as means of like creating a social event for people. And, their customs are different, or they don't have the same teachings, or you see them wearing, like they're a Southwestern tribe, but they're wearing Plains Indian designs and, not really knowing where they come from. Because when I grew up, you could always tell what tribe somebody was from by the designs and the beadwork that they had on their regalia. Yeah. In our ribbon work, you could really define what family or what clan that person came from because of the ribbon work. And now, because we're so much more connected, we kind of see people just taking designs that look really cool and using them because, they're trying to get into the powwow scene, but their people aren't really powwow. So they're kind of adopting it and just taking what they see, not really understanding like the meaning behind those designs or the ribbon work. And it's kind of good and it's kind of bad.
No,
it's got pros and cons.
So I know just what you mean. I have to say, I moved to New Mexico in the 90s and then moved back to Oklahoma in the 2000s. So I think we just passed each other. But when the first time I was talking to my Taos Pueblo friends, and they were like, oh, come up to the powwow. And then people were charging when I got there. I had never been to a charging powwow, in my life. And I was like, mortally offended. I mean, I grew up with my grandmother would go, oh, we can't put, we don't want too much green on your outfit. Then people will think you're Kiowa. Not too much green in your beadwork, not too much green in your outfit. Those are Kiowa colors. We do, red and blue. Come on. It was, we understood that, but it's a lot different now. I mean, like and I see people dance and they, who are multiple tribes, and they'll go, oh, well, I'm going to put on my Kiowa dress, and now I'm going to put on my Sac Fox dress. And I'm like, I really, I appreciate that because they're honoring all their heritage, but and that's a good thing. But I'm like, let me stop before I tell people to get off my lawn again.
Matt, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, for the past 60 years plus, we've seen a really large movement as far as like the pan-Indigenous like kind of situation where we're becoming far less worried about individual tribal things. Although, of course, you go to any reservation where that is still, we hold on to our customs that way. But ever since the internet, seemingly, the pan-Indigenous movement has gone way further than it ever has before, especially because we're trying to keep it seems like a lot of people are trying to keep tradition alive. They're basically like throwing all of it into one pot and they'll like, we'll sort it out later as long as we keep it going. And it is interesting to watch because like I love listening to old people go, this isn't how it was before. And I'm like, I feel you. However, this is what's happening now. So can you tell me what it was like so I can kind of sort through this?
Well,
Yeah, it's also kind of funny, right? 'Cause we're like, we're not a monolith, but yet
yeah,
we're slowly becoming homogenized.
and I
Well,
think that's the real problem. I mean, you
Mhm.
know, is that homogenization, because it's erasure.
Yeah, it
Because I
really
feel like
is.
the you know, when as tribes becoming too homogenized, amounts to erasure of our actual identities.
and on that note, like I know that my grandmother's tribe and my great grandfather's tribe, they're erased. And so they're actual, because of where we are in northern western Mexico and down in that region, because of genocides. And when I was doing my own background to make sure I get my traditions right, we don't exist. And basically what they did was, because so many of us were killed off, a lot of us were just put into one big giant tribe. And the only tribe that I know of, and I mean, this is just what I know of, is in New Mexico, that still holds our traditions. But I don't think it's the true traditions because of so many of the mixed people that had to form together to keep this alive. And it was weird and odd to me to move to Seattle. And when you tell people like, oh yeah, I'm Indigenous, they're like, oh, well, where do you like, what tribe? Where do you know, like, oh, you don't fit in these guidelines that I have,
Yeah.
so you can't really be Native. And it's like, oh, and then they're like, what percentage are you? And I'm like, what's a percentage?
Don't start with the
Even
quantum
like-
thing. Get out of here.
It's so difficult too, right? Because like I feel like we have to hold space because genocide has really done a number on us. And
Yeah.
it is really hard because we do have people who are reclaiming those lost heritages and they have every right to do that. I mean, when you look at the Wampanoag, you know, their language was considered an extinct, but they had somebody who actually was dreaming about people speaking to her in her language and she wanted to understand it. And, you know, she went back and she did everything she could to try and revive that language. And, you know, her children were the first fluent speakers born of their language in like over 300 something years. And that's so
Cool.
incredible to see. And we see tribes now that are, you know, going back and like we've had a lot of like coming of age ceremonies that were lost. And we have tribes that are going back and slowly trying to revive them through what histories they can find. And they may not be like 100% the way they were done originally, but they're close enough to where we can bring them back. And that's like a good thing because, you know, we constantly hear, you know, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, and we are, but we're not our ancestors. And the way that we're still trying to figure out like who we are now and who we're going to be in the future because we've already gone through an apocalypse. Like we're post Walking Dead, you know,
Yeah,
like we're in
right.
that phase.
Yeah.
New
And
lifestyle,
I
guys.
think
Just
that's
dropped.
absolutely right.
Like,
Welcome.
like we're in that phase of trying to
No.
figure out like who we're going to be
Yep.
and how it's going to work.
Well,
And I think
and this is the thing, we were never static.
exactly.
People talking about us like we were static and like we're museum pieces, and you're not a real, you know, whatever you try, but you're not a real. And this is kind of, and I feel like as a Comanche, I'm in a real weird position because we didn't exist, you know, thousands of years ago as a discrete people. We were actually a combination of Nahuatl and Shoshones. And that happened as a result of stealing horses from the Spanish. We also, Nahuatl people joined us. And joined a group of disaffected, let's say, Shoshones, and became one people. And so it's complicated, you know, and all of this is complicated, but we're not museum pieces, and there's not a, you know, oh, I have to say, when I first got on I think I stumbled accidentally onto Quora, like, you know, I'm going to say 15 years ago. And a guy was talking about, well, I went to a powwow in somewhere, and it was like a tourist. And he was like, and I only saw one couple, two people, it was like a father and son, dressed in what looked to be period correct costumes. And I was like, oh, and I congratulated them on the authenticity of their outfits, and they just looked at me, and they did not respond appropriately. They didn't seem to appreciate my congratulations at all. And I was like,
girl, when's the Indian period? I want to know.
I was like,
And and that's true though, because that comes up quite a bit, like what's traditional and what's not. Like as natives, I feel like we constantly are pressured that we have to choose.
yeah,
Like we're either going to be traditional or we're going to be contemporary. But for me, like I don't think we have to choose at all, because we are fully native no matter how we exist. And with regalia, like when I was back in 98, I was a princess for our tribe for the American Indian Exposition. I was one of several princesses that represented that powwow. And it was so strict. I had a chaperone who was my mom. But like they wanted me to stay strictly traditional. Like everything had to be our Otoe-Missouria regalia, because that was the tribe that I was representing. And like they wouldn't make any corrections, but I'm also disabled. I have lupus. And, back then, nobody really understood lupus or anything like that. It was a lot different. But I remember it was really hard on my body, but my mom would get mad at me because I couldn't be in the sun too long. And at the powwow, our like a tribal encampment, I actually passed out after my special from heat stroke. And my mom was mad at me, and she had me out there dancing that evening because that was what expected of a princess. And my great grandma kind of realized like, oh, like this isn't working, like something needs to change. And she made me regalia out of material that was really lightweight. In my shawl, she made me just kind of like a wraparound faux shawl that wasn't so heavy that I could carry while I was dancing, but she made me an accessible regalia. And she put a lot of thought into it. She beaded the ribbon work because my mom wouldn't let me have like a fancy and cool lace top, in the hot summer. A lot of girls wore tank tops and just lace tops over, instead of like the really thick gabardine and really silk heavy satins and stuff in the hot, but my grandma made me like a cotton shirt, and she put a lot of thought into it. And like people kind of thought it was weird at first because it wasn't like the traditional materials or anything. But when you consider that we have a lot of disabled natives, like culture should be accessible, and we should put a lot of thought into that. And I'm glad like we're in this space now where we're having more conversations. And and we see a lot more disabled people out in the arena dancing. And we still got a long way to go in that department of making it more accessible, but at least it's happening, and we're having those conversations. And we're having conversations about like being native isn't going to look just one way. Like there's not just one way to be native. Like it's going to be different from person to person. And there are going to be, it is a hard conversation because we do have to take into consideration like tribal sovereignty and federal recognition versus state recognition and all these little things. But at the same time, we also have to realize that none of that negates who we are as actual Indigenous people.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I was just listening to this whole thing because around the time that you were a princess, my cousin was Comanche princess, and she was on the heart-lung transplant list. And Comanche homecoming is in
like a week long.
August. It's in August, and it's required that you have to have a buckskin dress, and she borrowed a buckskin dress from me. And I was like, oh, Nina, don't let this kill you. I know you want to be a princess so bad, but don't let this. But it's all, we always have adapted.
Mm-hmm.
We have always changed and adapted. And, it's like, okay, we used to have flirting mirrors because men can't look, young unmarried men can't look directly at women. And so they had mirrors that was one of the reasons that mirrors were a big trade item. And they would bead them and hang them off their clothes so that they could look at women, look at girls, and make eye contact through the mirror. And now they're much bolder now, but they you will see, for a long time you would see, when everyone was deluged with AOL CDs in the mail and you could not
Yes.
beadmark those, and they would hang them like flirting mirrors on their regalia. And I thought it was super cool because it was in the spirit, in the traditional spirit, and yet it was new and old at the same time.
That's amazing.
That's really, I think that's the thing. The key is we need to remain ourselves while still growing and adapting. But it's important not to lose sight of our traditional values.
And we shouldn't have to explain them to everybody.
And we shouldn't have to, but also, like, we should be able, like, detribalized people who have been, and it's through, have been just forced to lose their identity. We need to take them back.
Yes.
Instead of throwing them away, because the goal of the colonizer is to make us disappear. Detribalization is one of the big tools. That's in the Lilith story. He's a guy whose tribe has been terminated they still are doing tribal terminations, but they were terminated in the 50s. And so he says he's not applicable because he's not white, but he's, his tribe doesn't exist. It's not recognized. And
I feel him.
So
I feel that. Oh.
So,
well, it's coming up on 9 o'clock, and I just want to say, all around, you guys have filled my soul, not just with stories, but just being able to talk about it. And thank you all so very much. I'm going to give you guys a quick more round to do a shout out for your next project and what you do, and then we'll close out for the night. Go ahead, Matt.
I am often on Twitch and TikTok just doing folklore stuff. So as far as big things are going, I don't think I really have too much at this very second in time. Just a bunch of writing.
Yeah. Johnnie?
Well, you guys can find me at GeekGirlCon coming up in October. I am super excited. I'm going to be doing Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse Red Style and also mapping the interior of Indigenous horror, which are two of my favorite things to talk about. Zombies and horror. But so you can check me out if you're in Seattle. And you can also find me on all the socials at Johnniejae.
Tali?
Hey, it's been so great spending time with you guys. You can find me everywhere at Tali Inlow, TaliInlow, TaliInlow.com. And then my most recent thing is that I actually got to write and publish with Coyote and Crow, which Weyodi is also very familiar with. The first in-universe novel in that the world of Coyote and Crow, which is a massive TTRPG that hopefully some people are familiar with. But yeah, that you can find that online. And yeah, thank you guys for sharing this space. It was amazing.
We actually played it here for GeekGirlCon. We had an amazing DM, and we did it for a while until recently was our last one. But yeah.
Oh, very cool.
Weyodi?
That's so cool. Aside from not sleeping for the next week after Johnnie's story, I will hiding all the dolls because I make dolls and covering up their little faces. Next year I have 2 books coming out. A science fiction, an Indigenous futurist science fiction novel called As Many Ships as Stars, and a graphic novel illustrated by Sade Coronas Esquivel called Chunky Ottaquasi, Finder of Lost Loves. Kind of a magical realist story set in southern Oklahoma in the 1980s. And I have more things in the works.
And so we were also talking about doing a little book club for Never Whistle at Night, which is a new book that just came out that has Indigenous folklore stories. It's supposed to be really kind of like spoopy. So I'm super excited because I will be contacting you all. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is Jfun. Thursday we have Common Hood at 7 p.m. And I believe we're gonna rate someone. Sorry, I didn't actually ask before I thought about this with their battles. Wait, okay, maybe Taryn's got it. So, but thank you all for joining us, and I really appreciate it. Next week on Tuesday, we'll do Raid in a minute. Okay, cool. We are doing our arts panel. You'll see a lot of these familiar faces on there. It's Latina and Latin and Indigenous art panel, which I'm also super excited about. We're just gonna touch base about like why we rock as artists. So I'll see you guys all next week. Have a wonderful night. Bye.